The Sinking of the Lisbon Maru is a documentary that charts the undertold and remarkable and devastating story of the sinking of the Lisbon Maru during World War II. The sinking saw 800 deaths of British prisoners of war as they were transferred to Japan. The documentary uses the stories of two survivors, plus multiple stories from families who have survived their relatives who had died in this tragic situation. The whole structure of this film is almost like a museum piece. It uses these interviews as well as artifacts, pictures, documents, and animation to tell the story of the sinking of the Lisbon Maru in a very linear fashion. And fundamentally, this is what this documentary does. And from that perspective, it fully delivers what it intends to do. I knew nothing about this ship. I have never even heard of it before. Yet I was able to educate myself of this horrific event. However, I also feel as a documentary, it's not the most innovative, and I don't think it intends to. And I think it is slightly over reliant on emotion and really using music to almost manipulate you into feeling when I don't necessarily think it needs to. However, I fully understand its purpose as telling these stories in a very simple and accessible way. So you can't discredit for that. However, I do think there's one thing I wished it would include, which was what was the learning from this? What do we get from this tragedy? We need to learn from it so other people don't go through this situation. And I think this applies to every documentary that covers the horrors of war. If we don't learn the lessons to prevent war in the future, it adds to the waste of life of that person who died in the war. They did have one survivor who is now based in Canada who was far less patriotic, and I think he went into much more detail about the absurdity of war and how it really should stop. This was China's submission for the last Oscars, and it was actually disqualified because the proportion of language in the English language was over 50%, and you can completely see that. However, I think this follows the trend of recent times where China has submitted nationalistic films in order to project a view of China. And this continues China's form of selecting films that are rather nationalistic. And this might be a surprise considering the amount of content dedicated to British soldiers. That 225 Chinese boat people went out to save British soldiers from the catastrophe. And from that point of view, this is a huge moment of national pride for those boat people saving British lives. And I think the big surprise from its selection is the fact it was chosen ahead of the Cannes winning Black Dog, which is a remarkable film. And to be honest, I think Black Dog would have had a much greater chance to make that final 15 shortlist. Unfortunately, The Sinking of the Lisbon Maru was also put forward for Best Documentary, but was not shortlisted. And I think China missed an opportunity to have their first shortlisting film for a number of years. You actually have to go back to 2002, where China submitted Hero, which got an Oscar nomination, the last Chinese film to make the Best International Feature Film category shortlist or nomination stage. And I think The Sinking of the Lisbon Maru is a very educational and interesting documentary. I just don't necessarily see it as an art house documentary. And it does its purpose, but it's not going to stick with me from an artistic perspective. And I don't think it intends to either. And for this reason, I'm going to give it 3 stars.